Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling evening in merry Mead where beneath candlelight and carols, a single whisper can turn Christmas peace into deadly silence. Tonight's mystery unfolds beneath falling snow, a tale of love, guilt, and betrayal where even the purest white hides crimson secrets. Nothing is as innocent as it seems. Before we begin, tell us, where are you listening from tonight? Are you warm and safe by the fire? Or perhaps, like Miss Marple, watching the fog outside your window? Do you still believe every secret deserves to stay hidden? Tell me in the comments. Snow had begun to fall softly over merry Mead, dusting the thatched rooftops and settling on the hedgerows like icing sugar on a Christmas cake. The village, always picturesque, now seemed lifted straight from a postcard, twinkling windows, wreaths on every door, and smoke curling lazily from cottage chimneys. Yet beneath the charm of the season, a strange quiet lingered, a silence that unsettled even the birds that perched on the bare holly branches. It was Christmas Eve, and the village should have been alive with cheer. But this year, laughter was scarce. The talk at the post office had been of one subject only: Mrs. Agatha Blackwood, the wealthy widow who had lived alone in the large stone house at the end of Willow Lane. Her husband, Colonel Blackwood, had passed 10 years prior, and she had since retreated into a life of solitude and charity, a figure both respected and pitied. 3 nights ago, her maid had found her sitting motionless in her drawing room, a half-empty glass of sherry beside her and the faint scent of lilies, her late husband's favorite flower, hanging in the air. At first glance, she had seemed asleep, but when the maid touched her hand, the truth became clear. Mrs. Blackwood was dead. The doctor had been quick to call it natural causes. After all, she was nearly 70, and the cold could be cruel to hearts already weakened by grief and age. But the village had its doubts. Mrs. Blackwood had been expecting a visitor that evening, though no one knew who. Her will had recently been rewritten, and the expression frozen on her face, part surprise, part horror, was enough to make even the doctor uneasy. Miss Jane Marple heard all of this while sitting by the fire in her cozy front room, knitting a scarf the color of winter sky. She listened as her companion, young Mrs. Hartnell, relayed the latest gossip in hushed tones. "They say she'd been seen arguing with that dreadful nephew of hers, the one from London," Mrs. Hartnell whispered, leaning forward eagerly. "Or perhaps it was about that companion she hired in November, a mysterious woman if ever there was one. And imagine closing the house for Christmas." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clinking rhythmically. "People often reveal more by what they do not say than by what they do," she murmured. "Tell me, dear, who was it that found her?" "The maid, of course. Poor thing's been staying with her sister since. Can't stop crying, they say." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, her eyes distant. "But tears, like words, can mean many things." Outside, the church bells began to toll 6, their echo rolling across the snowy fields. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine started rare for so late in the evening. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward her lace-curtained window. Something about this death troubled her, not in the way of tragedy, but of pattern. She had seen many tragedies in her long life. They rarely occurred without warning, and never without reason. A widow dying suddenly, days before Christmas, after rewriting her will and expecting company. No, it did not sit well at all. By the following morning, the village would awaken to new whispers. Inspector Cray from the county constabulary had been summoned, and word spread that Mrs. Blackwood's jewelry box was missing, along with a letter she had been writing that very night. As Miss Marple tied a blue ribbon around her finished scarf, she made a quiet decision. She would attend the funeral, of course, and afterward, perhaps, pay a little visit to Willow Lane. After all, she had known Mrs. Blackwood once, a long time ago, when they were both quite young, and there was something about old friendships that tended to uncover truths long buried under snow. The bells of Merry Mead Church tolled mournfully on Christmas morning, their sound mingling with the low murmur of villagers gathered outside the vicarage. Snow still clung to the eaves, glistening faintly in the pale winter sun, and every breath turned to mist as neighbors leaned close to whisper the latest speculation about Mrs. Blackwood's untimely end. There were condolences, of course, murmured dutifully, but beneath them ran a current of fascination and fear. It wasn't every year that death came calling at Christmas. At the heart of the chatter stood Miss Hartnell, eyes bright with purpose, recounting to an attentive audience that Inspector Cray had arrived from Much Benham the previous evening and spent over an hour inside Blackwood House. "And I hear," she confided in a tone that carried easily across the lane, "that he found something quite out of place in the drawing-room. Though what it was, no one will say. The maid Nora, I think her name is, refuses to speak to anyone." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the gate, caught every word without seeming to. Her delicate hands were clasped before her, her manner mild and self-effacing. To the casual eye, she was simply another elderly parishioner waiting for the vicar to begin his Christmas sermon, but her gaze was alert, thoughtful. She had attended Mrs. Blackwood's funeral the day before an austere, sparsely attended affair, with the widow's nephew, Mr. Lionel Pierce, looking suitably grief-stricken in his tailored black coat. Too suitably, perhaps. He had been charming, deferential even, when he spoke with the villagers afterward. He had also been the only person to stand by the grave after everyone else had gone. Miss Marple had observed how his gloved hand lingered on the headstone, not with affection, but as though confirming a certainty. It was a small thing, but small things often mattered most. Now, as the villagers filed into church, Miss Marple took a seat near the back, where she could both listen and think. The vicar's sermon on forgiveness and the hope of renewal floated past her in gentle waves. Her thoughts, however, remained with Mrs. Blackwood's empty house on Willow Lane. There were 3 details that troubled her deeply. First, the missing jewelry box. Mrs. Blackwood had been meticulous about her possessions, and theft seemed oddly crude for a woman of such propriety. Second, the vanished letter. The maid had said her mistress had been writing at the time of her death, yet not a scrap of paper was found upon the desk. And lastly, the lilies. No one could account for them. They had been placed neatly in a vase beside the armchair, fresh and fragrant despite the season. When the service ended, Miss Marple found herself approached by Reverend Clement, who offered her his arm as they walked out together. "A sad Christmas, Miss Marple," he sighed. "Agatha Blackwood was complicated, but she did good in her way. Left a fair bit to the parish, I hear." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, "and one wonders whether generosity, like other virtues, can sometimes prove fatal." The vicar blinked, uncertain how to reply. Miss Marple gave him a small, reassuring smile and turned toward the churchyard path. Across the snow, she saw Lionel Pierce speaking in low tones to a woman in a dark green coat, the widow's companion, Miss Lydia Crane. The young woman's face was pale, her posture tense, as if braced against a storm only she could feel. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them for a moment before she continued home. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would visit the late Mrs. Blackwood's maid. People in distress rarely lied convincingly. And grief, she had learned long ago, could be far more revealing than confession. She glanced back once more at the fading figures in the churchyard. Yes, something was wrong beneath the widow's Christmas silence, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and sharp eyes, meant to discover exactly what it was. The following afternoon dawned bleak and wind-bitten, the snow having hardened into an uneven crust that cracked underfoot. Miss Marple, bundled in her gray wool coat and modest hat, made her way along the narrow lane that led to Willow House. The tall iron gates stood slightly ajar, their hinges protesting softly in the cold. A constable stationed by the entrance nodded politely. Recognizing her as one of those village fixtures one doesn't quite question but always treats with respect, she returned the gesture with a mild smile and slipped through. The garden was lifeless now, the rose beds frozen and brittle, yet the faint scent of lilies still seemed to cling to the air. Miss Marple paused on the path, her eyes resting on the curtained windows. Inside, there were shadows moving. Inspector Cray and his men, no doubt, still engaged in their inquiries. She had no wish to intrude upon official business. Her purpose today was more delicate. She had arranged, through the vicar's wife, to visit Nora Mrs. Blackwood's maid, who was presently staying in a cottage near the green. It was not interrogation she sought, merely conversation. When she arrived, Nora answered the door herself, her eyes swollen from crying, but her manner eager, almost relieved, to have company. The small sitting room smelled faintly of lavender and tea, and a cat dozed by the hearth. Miss Marple allowed herself to be seated and accepted a cup of tea with quiet gratitude. They spoke first of ordinary things, the weather, the vicar's sermon, the kindness of Mrs. Hartnell who had sent a basket of scones. Only when the girl's trembling eased did Miss Marple, in her gentle, offhand way, turn the subject toward her late mistress. She was a lonely woman, I think, she began, stirring her tea. The house must have been very quiet at night. Nora nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Ever since the colonel died, it wasn't the same. She'd talk to herself sometimes, or sit in the drawing room and listen to the wind. Her eyes clouded. But she was kind. Truly she was. Paid me well and never cross, only she seemed frightened lately. Miss Marple looked up mildly. Frightened, dear? The maid hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. She said strange things. Said someone had been in the house. Once, she woke me in the middle of the night because she heard footsteps on the landing. But there was no one. I checked every room myself. How curious, murmured Miss Marple. Did she mention who she thought it might be? She never said. But she'd been writing letters, I think, to Mr. Lionel. She didn't trust him. Said he was desperate for money. And then, there was Miss Crane, the companion. Mrs. Blackwood liked her at first, but lately, Nora lowered her voice. Lately she seemed to fear her. I heard her tell the doctor, only a week before she died, that Miss Crane knew too much. Miss Marple's spoon stilled in the cup. Too much of what, I wonder? The maid shook her head miserably. I don't know, ma'am. Only that 2 nights before it happened, she made me lock every door and window. She even told me not to trust anyone who came asking questions. Miss Marple rose, her expression serene though her mind was racing. Fear, letters, missing jewelry, lilies, and now this mention of secrets. They were pieces of a puzzle, fragile but beginning to align. Needed. As she stepped back into the bitter air, she saw, quite by chance, a familiar figure leaving Willow House, Miss Lydia Crane herself, her gloved hand clutching a small parcel, her face pale as parchment. Their eyes met briefly across the lane. Miss Marple smiled, the kind of gentle smile that gave nothing away, and tipped her hat. Inside, however, her thoughts stirred sharply. It was not only the dead who kept their silences in Merry Mead. That evening, as twilight sank over Merry Mead, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, the fire burning low and steady. A skein of blue wool lay forgotten in her lap. Her mind was not upon her knitting but upon the words of young Nora and the image of Lydia Crane leaving Willow House with that curious little parcel. There was something in Miss Crane's pallor, not the grief of a devoted companion, but the tension of one who hides something. Miss Marple had seen it before, long ago, in another young woman who had once feared discovery far more than sorrow. She rose and went to the window, peering through the frost-laced glass. The village lay hushed under moonlight, its rooftops silvered, its lanes glimmering with thin sheets of ice. It was the kind of night when secrets whispered more clearly than voices. A knock sounded just then, firm, deliberate. She opened the door to find Inspector Cray standing on her threshold, his expression wearied but alert. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought you might have an insight or two." "You usually do." She smiled faintly and invited him in. He declined tea, but his eyes softened as they rested on her tidy hearth. "We've confirmed Mrs. Blackwood didn't die of heart failure," he said bluntly. "There were traces of digitalis, a heart medicine, but in a much higher dose than prescribed. Administered in her sherry, we believe." Miss Marple's brows lifted only slightly. "Ah," she murmured. "So it was not natural causes after all." "No, ma'am. Murder, I'm afraid. The nephew's alibi checks out. He was in London till the following morning. But Miss Crane—" He hesitated, glancing toward the window. "She's a curious one. Claimed she found Mrs. Blackwood already dead, though the maid swears she left the lady alive just an hour earlier, and now we can't account for that missing letter. Nor the jewelry box." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "You see, Inspector, There's a very old pattern in such matters. When death visits the lonely and the wealthy, it seldom travels alone, it brings greed or guilt as its companions. The inspector gave a half smile. You think greed, then? I think, she said gently, that the lilies were not placed there by chance. Mrs. Blackwood's late husband was fond of them, was he not? A sentimental choice. But a woman afraid seldom indulges sentiment on the eve of her death. Cray frowned. Then who placed them there? That, dear Inspector, is the very question one mustn't ask too loudly yet. When he left, the fire had nearly gone out. Miss Marple sat again in the quiet, her mind weaving threads together as deftly as her fingers once did the wool. Digitalis in the sherry, a deliberate act. Fear before death, not confusion, but knowledge. And a companion who had arrived suddenly, with no known past and a faint scar near her temple, something Miss Marple had noticed during the funeral but not remarked upon. She took up her notebook from the table and jotted a few words in her neat, slanted hand. Lily's forgiveness letter, missing Lydia, nervous Nora's warning. Then, after a pause, she added, someone else entered the house that night. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window panes, carrying with it the distant toll of the church clock. Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and sat for a while in darkness, thinking. Somewhere in the village, beneath all the stillness, she could feel the faintest tremor of guilt, quiet, deliberate, waiting to be uncovered. And she knew that soon, very soon, she would see which of them broke first under the weight of their own silence. The next morning brought with it a brittle frost and a brittle calm. The village stirred sluggishly after the bleak news. And though the snow had turned to thin slush along the lanes, the air remained heavy with unspoken questions. Miss Marple rose early, her mind as precise as her movements, and penned a short note which she sent through young Tommy Gregg, the butcher's boy, to Inspector Cray at the constabulary. It contained only one sentence. It might be wise to look for whoever purchased lilies in the last fortnight. She knew such flowers were uncommon in December, and rarer still in Merry Mead. Someone had gone to deliberate effort to find them. That kind of effort was seldom innocent. After breakfast, Miss Marple set out toward the post office under the pretense of buying stamps, but with every intention of stopping by the florist's shop adjoining it. Mrs. Larkin, the florist, was arranging holly wreaths in the window, her fingers red from cold. She greeted Miss Marple with her usual cheer, though her curiosity shone through almost immediately. Terrible business, that poor widow. She sighed. They say poison now. I can't imagine who'd do such a dreadful thing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, very dreadful. Oh, I wonder. Mrs. Larkin, did anyone happen to order lilies recently? I was thinking of something simple for the church altar this Sunday, but I doubt they'd survive the cold. The florist frowned thoughtfully. Lilies? No, not for weeks, oh. Wait now. That's not quite true. I did have a special order about a week before Christmas. A dozen white lilies, fresh from London, cost a fortune. They did. How very extravagant for the season, said Miss Marple lightly. Do you happen to recall who ordered them? Mrs. Larkin pursed her lips. I do. And that's the odd part. They were delivered to Willow House, but not in Mrs. Blackwood's name. The order came under Miss Crane's. Miss Marple's eyes did not widen, but her pulse quickened. Dear me. Miss Crane. How thoughtful of her. And she paid in cash? I suppose? Indeed she did. Crisp notes, too. Miss Marple thanked her warmly, and went on her way, though her thoughts were now a tangle of deduction. Lydia Crane, nervous, secretive, frightened, and yet she had gone out of her way to procure lilies, the very symbol of remembrance and purity, for a woman who was terrified of her. Unless, of course, the gesture had another purpose entirely. When she returned home, Inspector Cray was waiting for her at the gate, his hat pulled low against the chill. I received your note, Miss Marple, he said without preamble. You were right, the flowers came from the London market, ordered locally by Miss Crane. But here's something else. The doctor's report arrived this morning. The dosage of digitalis was mixed not into the sherry bottle itself, but only into the glass. Miss Marple's expression softened into one of mild curiosity. So it was meant for a particular sitting, then a private drink. A guest, perhaps. Cray nodded grimly. Possibly. The maid insists no one came that evening. But one set of footprints was found near the side gate, half buried in snow. Too small for the nephew, too heavy for the maid. Ah, said Miss Marple gently, her gaze lifting toward the quiet lane beyond. Then the lilies, the poison, the missing letter, they all point to one thing. Someone intended for that night to appear merciful. A peaceful death in a chair, framed by flowers. She turned back to the inspector, her eyes bright as ice. But mercy, Inspector, is rarely so carefully arranged. That afternoon, clouds gathered low over the village, muting what little sunlight had struggled through. The air felt heavy, the way it does before snow begins again, and Miss Marple found herself walking slowly along Willow Lane, her steps measured, her mind occupied. The pieces of the puzzle were arranging themselves. But something still eluded her, a small, human inconsistency, the kind that reveals everything once properly noticed. She paused outside the wrought iron gates of Willow House. The police had finished their search, leaving behind a chill emptiness. Miss Marple slipped inside quietly, her presence permitted by Inspector Cray's indulgent courtesy. He knew she would not disturb evidence indeed. She often saw what others missed. Inside, the grand old house was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the hall. The smell of old furniture polish mingled faintly with that lingering, too sweet scent of lilies. It clung to the drapes, the carpets, even the air, a ghost of perfume masking something less delicate. Miss Marple wandered into the drawing room, the scene of Mrs. Blackwood's death. The chair still stood angled toward the hearth, as if waiting for its occupant to return. The empty sherry glass had been removed, but a small ring remained on the side table, not a wine mark, as the inspector had thought, but faint and powdery, as though from the base of a small vial. Miss Marple bent closer, her eyes narrowing. She touched the residue gently and brought her fingers to her nose. Bitter. Not from sherry at all. Her gaze moved across the room to the desk where the letter had vanished, to the vase of lilies, now brown at the edges. Someone had meant for those flowers to be noticed, and in doing so, they had drawn attention away from something else entirely. Miss Marple knelt slightly, inspecting the floor near the fireplace. There, just beneath the rug's corner, a glint caught her eye, a small, gold button, the kind found on a gentleman's glove. She held it between her fingers thoughtfully. Miss Crane wore none such thing. When she stepped back into the hall, she nearly collided with Lydia Crane herself. The young woman had just arrived, escorted by one of the constables. She looked pale, exhausted, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's. "I only came to collect my things," she said quickly. "Inspector Cray said I might." "Of course, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "Loss is a heavy thing to pack alongside one's belongings. But I wonder, were you fond of lilies?" Miss Crane blinked, startled by the question. "Lilies? I suppose they were Mrs. Blackwood's favorite. She spoke of them often. Indeed, I was merely curious. Such trouble to fetch them in winter." Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves. "I only wished to comfort her," she murmured. She'd been so ill. And well, she asked for peace. Miss Marple regarded her for a moment. "Peace can mean so many things, my dear. Sometimes it is requested. Sometimes arranged." Miss Crane's lips parted as if to reply, but she said nothing. She turned abruptly toward the stairs, her composure cracking. As she disappeared from sight, Miss Marple noted that her left glove was missing a button, a twin to the one now hidden discreetly in her pocket. When Inspector Cray appeared moments later, Miss Marple handed him a slip of paper on which she had written 3 words. "The lilies lied." He frowned, puzzled. "What does that mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes glimmering. "It means, Inspector, that flowers can be deceitful, especially when meant to conceal the scent of something far less fragrant." Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall again, silent and patient, as if the village itself were holding its breath for what would come next. Inspector Cray returned to the constabulary that evening with Miss Marple's cryptic note still in his hand. The lilies lied. The words puzzled him, yet something in Miss Marple's calm certainty told him it was not whimsy but direction. He had learned, as others had before him, that when the old lady from the high street spoke in riddles, truth was never far behind. Meanwhile, Miss Marple herself sat quietly by her fire, a shawl about her shoulders, her mind moving delicately through each thread of the case as if through her knitting. Every fact, every hesitation of voice, every look exchanged at the funeral or in conversation began now to align. Lydia Crane had lied, of that she was certain, but it was not a lie of hatred or greed. Miss Marple knew the tone of a desperate lie, one born not from malice but from protection. Lydia had ordered the lilies to hide the scent of something else, something chemical, perhaps medicinal. The air that night must have reeked faintly of poison, and lilies would disguise it beautifully. And yet, there was that missing letter, the gold button, the nephew in London. Miss Marple had not forgotten Lionel Pierce, nor the peculiar way he had watched Lydia during the funeral. His eyes had followed her, not with affection, but with wariness, the kind one reserves for accomplices who know too much. The next morning, she paid a visit to the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Clement sorting through donations for the church bazaar. Amidst the clutter of baskets and parcels, Miss Marple quietly steered their conversation toward the widow's family. "I do wonder," she said softly, "how well that nephew of Mrs. Blackwood's knew his aunt's affairs." Mrs. Clement sighed. "Oh, quite well, I should think. He used to visit twice a year until she stopped sending him money. Said he'd fallen on hard times, something to do with gambling, I believe. Then he turned up again just last week, stayed one night at the inn, and left the morning after she died. Very tragic timing, poor fellow." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. "Tragic indeed." By the time she returned home, the faint shape of understanding had taken root. That evening, she requested Inspector Cray's company once more. He arrived just after dusk, bringing a gust of cold air with him. Miss Marple motioned him toward the fire and handed him a small parcel, the gold button, polished and placed neatly inside. "From Miss Crane's glove," she said, "but not the glove she wore that evening. This one came from a gentleman's pair. I believe she found it that night and kept it hidden out of fear or guilt. I'm not yet sure." Cray turned the button over, examining its engraved crest. "Pierce," he muttered. "Same pattern on Lionel's coat buttons." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "I think Mr. Pierce came to Willow House after all by the side gate, perhaps. Mrs. Blackwood might have agreed to see him privately, perhaps even to forgive him, but he came not for forgiveness, I fear, but for fortune. Only he did not expect Miss Crane to return early and witness what followed." Cray's jaw tightened. "You mean?" Miss Marple inclined her head gently. The poison in the sherry was his doing, but Lydia's silence afterward was hers. She feared the scandal, perhaps even believed her own compassion could rewrite what had been done. So she staged the lilies, a symbol of peace, and said nothing. A man who kills out of desperation may find courage when cornered, but not the kind that saves him. Outside, the church clock struck 9, and the faint toll echoed across the snowbound village. In its rhythm, Miss Marple heard the slow approach of justice. Steady as the fall of each flake against her window pane, Inspector Cray moved swiftly that night, the frost crunching beneath his boots as he crossed the lane toward the inn. Through the frosted window panes, the warm glow of lamplight spilled out, and there, seated near the fire, was Lionel Pierce, impeccably dressed but restless, a man accustomed to charm masking unease. When Cray entered, Pierce looked up sharply, then forced a smile. "Inspector," he said lightly, "still troubling yourself over my poor aunt's misfortune?" "Indeed," Cray replied, taking the chair opposite him. "You left rather abruptly after her funeral. Thought it might be best to have another word." Pierce's gaze flickered. "I had business in London. You can hardly expect a man to linger in a house of death." Cray leaned forward slightly. "Strange thing, then, that your glove button was found near her hearth." The silence that followed was brief but sharp as glass. Pierce's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, then stilled. "Nonsense," he said finally, his voice controlled. "I haven't been near that house in months." Cray's expression didn't change. "Then perhaps you'd not object to a search." The young man laughed, though the sound rang hollow. "If you must, though I assure you—" He stopped as Cray's gaze fixed on his pocket. The inspector reached forward, and after a moment's hesitation, Pierce handed over a small object, a woman's locket, gold, engraved with the initials A. B. Cray opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a younger Mrs. Blackwood. Inside, the faintest trace of white powder lingered along the hinge. Digitalis residue. Seems your business brought you closer than you claim, Cray said quietly. Pierce rose suddenly, his composure cracking. You don't understand. She was going to disinherit me, everything gone. Every shilling. I only meant to frighten her, to make her change her mind. She drank it before I could stop her. Cray stood too. That's not what the evidence says. You poured her drink. You stayed long enough to take her jewels, and that letter, the one naming her new heir. We found it in your trunk. Pierce's shoulders sagged. And what of? Miss Crane? He muttered bitterly. She saw nothing, yet she condemned me with her silence. She could have told you I begged her for help that night. She may have tried to protect you once, Cray said, but not anymore. By the time the carriage reached the constabulary, Pierce was silent, his bravado gone. Cray sent word immediately to Miss Marple. When she arrived the next morning, calm as ever, she found the inspector waiting with the written confession. She read it through without triumph. Only a faint, melancholy nod. Poor boy, she said softly. He mistook desperation for courage. But Miss Crane, she will live with guilt, I think, far longer than he will face punishment. Cray sighed. I don't think she'll speak of it again. No, said Miss Marple, folding her gloves neatly. But silence, Inspector, is never empty. It echoes always, especially at Christmas. Outside, the church bell tolled once more, and the snow began again, thin flakes drifting across the cobbles. Miss Marple turned toward the lane leading home, her figure small but steady against the white expanse. Behind her, the village exhaled the long, cold silence of the widow's house finally broken. The following morning dawned pale and still, as if the whole village were exhaling after holding its breath too long. News of Lionel Pierce's arrest spread swiftly, carried in low voices through the post office and murmured behind shop counters. Mary Mead, always eager for gossip, now whispered with uneasy reverence. Poison at Christmas, it was the sort of tale that left even the boldest villagers double-bolting their doors and eyeing their sherry with suspicion. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her window with a cup of tea, gazing at the soft fall of snow over the churchyard. There was no satisfaction in the outcome, only a quiet, inevitable sadness. Human nature, she reflected, rarely surprised her anymore, but it always pained her just the same. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, Lydia Crane stood there, pale and solemn, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Miss Marple motioned her inside without a word, and the young woman sat before the fire, clutching her gloves tightly in her lap. For a while, neither spoke. The clock ticked softly, and outside, a robin hopped along the windowsill, pecking at invisible crumbs. I heard, Lydia said at last, her voice small. They've taken him to London. He confessed, didn't he? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear, though I dare say he confessed more easily once he saw there was no longer any need to pretend. He seemed relieved, in a way. Lydia's eyes glistened. I suppose I should be too, but I'm not. I keep thinking I could have stopped it. If I'd spoken sooner, if I hadn't helped arrange things to look so peaceful, perhaps none of it would have gone so far. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. You acted out of fear and pity. Those are terribly human motives, Miss Crane. But I should like to ask, why lilies? Why go to such trouble? Lydia stared into the fire, her voice trembling. She loved them. Colonel Blackwood used to bring her lilies every Christmas. When I saw what he'd done, I thought, perhaps if it looked peaceful, people would believe she'd died naturally. I couldn't bear the thought of her name being dragged through scandal. Or his. I thought I could make it all disappear. Miss Marple's gaze softened. But truth, my dear, is like snow, it covers everything for a time. But underneath, the ground remains unchanged. It only waits to be seen again. A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek. I suppose you're right. I'll be leaving Mary Mead after the funeral. I can't stay where everyone looks at me and remembers. Miss Marple rose and laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. You'll find peace in time, but remember this. What you did, misguided though it was, came from compassion. And compassion, when purified by pain, becomes wisdom. Use it well. Lydia managed a small, broken smile, thanked her softly, and left. Miss Marple stood for a moment by the door, watching the young woman disappear down the snowy path, her green coat a fading mark against the white. Then she turned back to the fire and sighed. That evening, Inspector Cray stopped by to give his final report. The stolen jewels had been recovered from Pierce's trunk, the missing letter too. The case, as far as the law was concerned, was closed. But as he stood by the hearth, he asked quietly, You don't think Miss Crane was part of it, do you? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. She was part of the tragedy, but not the crime. The difference, though subtle, is everything. Outside, the snow fell thicker now, blanketing the village in white silence once more. And in that silence, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resumed, her thoughts calm. Christmas had come again to Mary Mead, not merry, not joyous, but mercifully quiet. A week later, Mary Mead had begun to thaw. The snow melted in thin rivulets along the cobbled streets, revealing damp earth and the first shy tips of green beneath the hedgerows. Life, as it always did, moved quietly back to its rhythm. The post office gossip turned once more to weather and recipes. The church bells resumed their steady, peaceful tone, and the tragedy of Willow House became, little by little, another of those stories the village would recall in murmurs when the nights grew long. But for Miss Marple, the matter did not quite rest. There was something about the case that still stirred faintly at the edge of her thoughts, a whisper of unfinished truth that would not entirely still itself. That whisper found its voice one morning when the vicar came calling, his expression troubled. My dear Miss Marple, he said, lowering himself into the chair opposite her fire, I thought it best you should know. Miss Crane left the village yesterday morning early, without a word to anyone. The housekeeper at Willow House says she found an envelope for me. Inside was a small brooch gold, with a lily engraved upon it and a note. It read simply, For the Church Restoration Fund, for forgiveness. Miss Marple sat back, her needles paused mid-air. How thoughtful of her, she said softly. Though I wonder whether forgiveness given to others ever truly heals what we cannot forgive in ourselves. The vicar sighed. You think she'll find no peace? I think, said Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, that she will spend her life searching for it. But perhaps that is the only just sentence she deserves. The vicar nodded gravely, then rose to go. As he left, a shaft of pale sunlight broke through the window and fell across the table, glinting upon the silver teapot. Miss Marple's gaze lingered there for a long moment before she rose and went to the window, looking out toward Willow Lane. The house stood distant and cold, its chimneys no longer smoking, its windows shuttered against the world. Yet she fancied she could still see, in her mind's eye, the faint glow of that drawing-room fire, the glass of sherry glinting on the side table, and beside it the lilies beautiful, deceitful, and strangely human in their perfection. Later that afternoon, Inspector Cray stopped by to bid her farewell before returning to Much Benham. We've concluded the matter officially, he told her, standing at her gate. Pierce will face trial come spring. Open and shut, as far as the Crown's concerned. But I'll confess something. Miss Marple, you've given me a new respect for small things. The way you saw what no one else did, the lilies, the button, the silences. I'd have called them trivial once. She smiled faintly. Trivialities, Inspector, are the fingerprints of truth. People hide their wickedness in large acts. It is the little gestures that betray them. Always watch how a person holds a cup, or closes a door, or says good night. He tipped his hat, amused and admiring, then took his leave. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression serene, though her eyes remained thoughtful. The village was quiet again, yet peace never seemed quite complete after such things. Evil, she knew, was never foreign. It was merely human weakness in its Sunday best. That night, she sat once more by her fire, finishing the scarf she had begun the day Mrs. Blackwood died. It was a simple thing, sky blue and soft to the touch, but as she tied the final knot, she thought of the widow's frightened eyes, the companion's trembling hands, and the nephew's desperate lies. She placed the finished scarf in a drawer, folded neatly among others, and whispered to the empty room. And so ends another lesson in human nature. Outside, a cold wind rose again across Merry Mead, brushing through the bare trees like a sigh. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled softly one chime, then another, as if the village itself were murmuring a quiet prayer for those who could no longer speak. The thaw continued in earnest, loosening the iron grip of winter so that gutters ran with steady threads and the hedgerows turned a damp, shining green. With it the village's mind loosened too, each day giving back a little of the old routine. The clink of bottles on the milk cart at dawn, the tidy tapping of Mrs. Larkin's shears in the florist's, the cheerful fuss of hens behind Mr. Archer's gate. Yet as life resumed its rhythm, Miss Marple remained attuned to the undertone that lingered, a single unresolved note, scarcely audible, but present all the same. She did not call it doubt. The law's work had been sound. It was simply that human stories rarely ended neatly with a confession and a cell. There are after-sounds in the heart. That faint note tugged her toward the solicitors in Much Benham on a raw morning watered by mist. Mr. Pritchard was a careful, pink-faced man who worshipped both leather ledgers and propriety, and he received Miss Marple with the respect owed to someone who, while not a client, was indubitably part of the local establishment. She asked, in her mildest manner, for clarity on one point only: the letter Lionel had stolen from Mrs. Blackwood's desk on the night of her death. Merely instructions concerning a codicil, Mr. Pritchard replied, adjusting his spectacles. Your discretion is assumed, Miss Marple. It often is, she agreed. He cleared his throat. The codicil settled the bulk of the estate upon a beneficiary identified not by name, but by token, a small brooch with a lily engraving and a note that the beneficiary's initials were L.C., proof of identity to be made privately to me, and only after Mrs. Blackwood's passing. I believe that is the sort of romantical business people like to read in novels, but in practice it is the very devil for solicitors. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the polished desk. And yet the token exists. The vicar received a brooch from Miss Lydia Crane for the Church Restoration Fund, a lily engraved upon it. Mr. Pritchard stared. Good heavens! The letter stolen by Lionel concealed two truths, Miss Marple said softly. One, his disinheritance. The other, the identity of the intended heir. He stole not merely for gain, but to erase the person for whom the gain was meant. Mr. Pritchard sat back, chastened by the simplicity of it. Then Miss Crane must be informed without delay. She has left the village, Miss Marple replied, but we might yet reach her if we appeal to the proper instinct, not greed. Belonging. On her way home, Miss Marple called at the vicarage. The vicar produced the brooch from a small box with reverent care. It was old, delicately worked, a lily whose petals curled back upon themselves with a grace not often seen now. Miss Marple turned it in the light and noticed, on the reverse, two faintly scratched letters M.C., imperfectly effaced by time and wear. She did not start. She had expected something of the sort. May I borrow this for a day, vicar? He hesitated, then nodded. If you think it might do good. I think, said Miss Marple, it may do justice. That afternoon she walked to a cottage at the far edge of the parish, where a retired housekeeper named Missus Partridge lived with a canary and the habit of remembering precisely what others had forgotten, over seed cake and a rather militant tea. Miss Marple inquired after the staff of Willow House in the years when Colonel Blackwood was alive. Names came like beads on a string: cooks and gardeners, parlour-maids and nurses, and then at last, Mary Crane, said Mrs. Partridge, tapping her spoon. Pretty thing, too pretty for service, they said. Disappeared one spring with a weak chest that was the family story, and when she returned, it was to a different post a dozen miles off, left no address. Such things were managed with tact in those days. Tact, Miss Marple echoed. The corner of her mouth lifted. a virtue that often hides a multitude of sins. She thanked Mrs. Partridge and left, the mist fine on her face and the road a ribbon of pale mud. The pattern was now complete enough to see. Mary Crane, the parlor maid, a youthful folly carefully domesticated into silence. A brooch, inscribed with her initials, later adopted as a token for a daughter bearing her name. A rich widow, whose fear had not been of murder alone but of exposure, and a companion who had arrived at Willow House unaware that the echo of her own past, her very surname, was threaded into its walls. When Lydia had come to understand, she had ordered lilies to stage peace, yes, but she had also clutched at the one emblem that proved she belonged to the very house that had condemned her mother to vanish. She had given that emblem to the church in a gesture that looked like renunciation, but felt to Miss Marple more like a plea. Make of my shame something good. Miss Marple wrote a notice for the parish magazine that evening. It mentioned, in unassuming language and in a corner nobody read except those who needed to, that the vicar sought to return a personal token left anonymously, a keepsake with floral design of sentimental value, to the gentlewoman who had placed it in the Restoration Fund, and that any letter sent to the vicarage would be forwarded in confidence. It was the sort of notice designed not to spread, but to reach. A week passed. Snowdrops pricked like white flames in the churchyard. One morning the vicar came up the path with an envelope and the relieved look of a man who has been trusted. Miss Marple took the letter and read it at her table while the kettle murmured. It was written in a steady hand that had sworn not to tremble. Again. I did not know when I came to Willow House. I thought myself fortunate to find work, to be useful, to give comfort. Then I found a photograph in a desk, a young woman with my face and my mother's eyes. I asked no questions because I feared the answers. Mrs. Blackwood offered kindness, then fear. She meant to provide for me, I believe, but feared what it would mean. When Lionel came that night and the terrible thing happened, I mistook love for concealment. I cannot accept her fortune. I do not wish to be paid for a secret that was not mine to keep. But I will accept a truth, that I was loved by someone, once, for at least a little while. If the token entitles me to anything, let it be this: the right to bear my mother's name openly. I am Lydia Mary Crane now, and that is enough. There was no address, only a town name at the coast, and the outline of a future sketched with dignity rather than demands. Miss Marple folded the letter and sat for a while with the brooch warm in her palm. Then she sent 2 notes. One to Mr. Pritchard to arrange what could be arranged without injury to Lydia's wishes, a modest provision perhaps directed to a Miss L.M., Crane of no fixed address, to be drawn discreetly as needed. And the second, a shorter letter, to Lydia herself, addressed to Poste Restante at the coastal town named in her note. My dear child, she wrote, the law concerns itself with property. The heart concerns itself with heritage. You may decline the first and still possess the second. I suggest you keep the brooch. The church can spare its adornment. A daughter should not. Spring reached Merry Mead gradually but unmistakably. The hedges fattened with buds. The grocer shelved the first bitter oranges of marmalade season. Children quarreled less fiercely with their scarves. Mrs. Blackwood's house was shuttered, soon to be catalogued and sold. Inspector Cray's reports no longer arrived. The village spoke less often of lilies and poison and more of seed packets and paint. And Miss Marple, having tied off the last loose thread, returned as she always did to her knitting and her observations. On a mild afternoon, she walked to the church and stood where the snowdrops had given way to primroses. She thought of a lonely woman who had tried to buy peace with money, of a frightened girl who had tried to shape mercy out of a terrible night, and of a foolish young man who had thought fortune could be bullied into his pocket. She thought, too, of a brooch now pinned at the throat of a young woman lifting her face to a sea wind somewhere far from Merry Mead, and she was satisfied not that everything was fair, for life seldom is, but that what could be mended had been. The bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple turned toward home, small and neat in her blue coat. And if her step seemed lighter, it was only because that unresolved note had at last found its chord. The primroses along the church wall had thickened into pale constellations by the time the auction notices for Willow House went up. Mr. Ellis, the agent, pasted them neat as legal scripture in the post office window. and for 3 mornings together the villagers paused there, reading the lots aloud as if reciting a litany. To most it was a curiosity mahogany this, Meissen that, a pianoforte, in need of attention, carpets Persian, with small moth damage. But to Miss Marple, who stopped between the greengrocer and the ironmonger with her basket poised at her wrist, it was a chapter heading. Houses that had harbored secrets did not release them all at once. They leaked them, like light from old shutters. And if one wanted to know the truth of a household, one could do worse than to listen to what people bid for and why. On the morning of the viewing, a crisp, genial sun lit the ivy on the willow house facade and threw the interior into stages of memory. The rooms looked larger, emptied of their familiar life. Even the drawing room, where the false piece of lilies had once stood, had softened into a dignified, impersonal space of polished wood and disciplined air. A string of strangers moved through it with catalogues in hand, the kind of people who spoke in phrases like good condition for the period and minor losses, whose eyes measured not sentiment but resale. But there were villagers too, and it was their reasons that interested Miss Marple. She watched Mrs. Hartnell finger a silver-backed brush with the cautious reverence one reserves for other women's vanities. Mr. Archer, counting the chairs and imagining Christmas tables. Mrs. Larkin examining a glass cloche and murmuring something about forcing bulbs next winter. Miss Marple made her way gently, avoiding the crowding elbows, and paused near a small escritoire set against the window. It was not a grand piece colonial, perhaps, with a narrow bank of pigeonholes and a drawer fitted with old sticky runners. The tag tied to its handle read, Lot 47, writing desk, with key. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the wood. She could see Mrs. Blackwood sitting there, perhaps years ago, before fear had made her lonely, before grief had carved the house into a mausoleum for lilies. She could see slender letters beginning, unsent, and others carefully folded, saved against some imagined revelation. She could see, because she had spent a lifetime observing, the human debris drawers collect, odd buttons, a bit of sealing wax, addresses no longer current, a pressed leaf. Are you thinking of bidding, Miss Marple? Inspector Cray's voice came to her shoulder with its cordial dryness. He looked more rested of late, as if the case had been a winter illness he was finally shaking off. I am thinking of something else, she returned, and smiled. But I shall put in a small bid if the spirit moves me. He followed her glance to the desk and nodded. We went through all the drawers, I assure you. I never doubted it, she said. But drawers behave better for the person who understands what they were meant to keep. He raised an eyebrow, amused, and moved on to speak to the auctioneer. Miss Marple remained by the window a little longer, then slipped her hand, light as a leaf, along the inner edge of the right-hand pigeonhole, where the varnish had been rubbed by years of envelopes sliding against it. There, under the lip, her finger met the rasp of unpolished wood and something that yielded with a tiny, stubborn click. A narrow, false bottom lifted the smallest fraction. Miss Marple did not pry. She merely learned. There were some discoveries one did not make in public if one wished to keep them from becoming theater. She lowered the sliver delicately back into place and let the crowd bear her into the corridor. She drifted through the house like a memory, pausing over objects that seemed to call to her. A sewing caddy with a darning mushroom polished to satin. A shelf of battered novels with the kernels tidy. Possessive initials stamped in blue. A small portrait, not catalogued, propped carelessly by a stack of china. A young woman in a pale dress whose mouth tilted into the beginning of laughter. Not Mrs. Blackwood, not quite. The eyes were darker, the jaw softer. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment, then set the portrait back where she had found it. Not every string needed tugging in a room full of people. The sale itself was brisk. Bidders nodded. Numbers rose. The auctioneer kept an easy, educated patter like a curate with a sermon he had delivered often. The desk came up mid-morning. Miss Marple, who had taken a chair near the back beside Mrs. Clement, lifted her catalogue at a modest figure and was surprised to find none competing her. Perhaps the runners had frightened the dealers. Perhaps her neighbors respected what they sensed she wanted. The hammer fell quickly. Lot 47 was hers. Will you keep it in your parlor? Mrs. Clement asked, pleased for her. For a time, Miss Marple said. folding her slip with prim satisfaction. "I think it has one more letter to deliver." She arranged delivery for that afternoon and went home by the lane where the ripe smell of thawing earth rose in pleasant waves. When the porter and his boy brought the desk into her sitting room and set it beneath the window, she thanked them and saw them out with a slice of fruit cake each. Then she locked the front door, drew the curtain half across the glass, and sat down before the escritoire as one sits across from an old friend finally ready to speak. The key turned with a well-bred click. The first drawer yielded nothing but stationery and a box of wafers. The second, pins, sealing wax, a small twist of ribbon. The third, nothing at all. She moved to the pigeonholes, lifted the familiar lip, and pressed. The little panel released itself with a sigh, as if grateful to be recognized. Behind it lay a narrow compartment just wide enough for a few folded sheets. Miss Marple slid them out and laid them on the desk like fallen petals. There were 3. The uppermost was a draft, the hand shakier, the ink blotched, addressed to Mr. Pritchard but never finished. It began, "If anything should happen to me before Christmas, I desire that the attached be executed at once. I have made a mistake in my life that I cannot speak in church about, and I do not know whether God requires a public confession or a private amends. I think a private amends, if it spares the innocent." The second was a single page in a younger, steadier hand, Mrs. Blackwood in her 40s. Perhaps, and it made Miss Marple close her eyes a moment for the tenderness of it. "To M.C., who was kind when kindness was costly. I have not forgotten. If I could turn back years, I would. I cannot. If there is any mercy in the world, let it fall upon her child." The third was the longest. Miss Marple read it last, because she had learned that the heart prepares itself for certain sentences only by tasting the ones before. It was dated 2 weeks before Mrs. Blackwood's death and sealed with a little dab of wax no larger than a pea. It was addressed to Lydia Crane. "My dear," it began, and there were no formalities after that. The letter was an apology and an explanation, not a dramatic one, but the plain speech of a woman who had kept company with her own silence too long. There had been a parlor maid. There had been a colonel full of charm and entitlement. There had been a decision, taken by 2 women under the pressure of what was expected of them, that one of them would go away and the other would forget. Except the one who stayed had never forgotten. She had sent money to the address she was given until the letters stopped returning and took it. In a manner strict women call moral and kind women call fearful, for a sign to cease. "I hired you without knowledge," Mrs. Blackwood had written. "I saw only capability and decorum. I learned the rest by accident, a likeness in a photograph, a housekeeper's half-remembered name, the brooch you wore once on a Sunday. I meant to tell you after Christmas. I meant to do it properly, with witnesses and a prayer. Forgive me that I waited. I was afraid. I have been afraid most of my life. And fear makes cowards of the respectable." Miss Marple put her hand atop the pages and sat very quietly while the clock on the mantel counted the old gilt and the new grace together into one thing like pity. Then she rose, put on her coat, and walked to the vicarage. The vicar read the letter without flourish, his kind face growing somber, and then, at the end, gentle. "Shall we send it on?" he asked. "In a way," Miss Marple replied. "Not as a debt, for Lydia refuses that. As a gift with no strings. Mr. Pritchard can draw upon the funds earmarked for anonymous charity in Mrs. Blackwood's will, you know, the line item that always puzzled him, and set aside a small annuity payable to Miss Lydia Mary Crane where she chooses to receive it. No more than is decent, enough that she may finish whatever quiet education she wishes, or begin a small place of her own without fear. We will send the letter to the poste restante she gave, with the simple note that a final paper has been found which alters nothing of law and everything of meaning." The vicar nodded, visibly moved. "You have a way, Miss Marple, of measuring out justice in teaspoons instead of ladles. It seems to sit better on the stomach." "It sits better on the conscience," she said. "Ladles tend to slop." There were a few small offices after that, letters to be written with care, Mr. Pritchard to be nudged with the precise pressure he admired, a discreet advertisement withdrawn from the parish notice board. The portrait of the laughing young woman Miss Marple purchased quietly the following day when the auctioneer, grateful for local cooperation, offered unsold lots at modest price. She wrapped it in brown paper and string and posted it with the letter. She thought it might help a daughter to have her mother's face, not as a rumor, but as a thing one could look at on difficult mornings. Spring matured. Garden forks lifted the soil. Boys went about with their pockets full of marbles. Mrs. Larkin tied up bunches of narcissus and argued with herself about the placement of gladiolus corms. Miss Marple sat in her parlor in the blue hour between tea and lamplighting, her knitting in her lap, and listened to the village settling itself. Occasionally, when the wind turned, she could still smell in memory the faint sweetness of lilies overlying something sharper, but the sensation no longer pricked. It announced itself only to be folded back into the larger pattern of lived things. Love, fear, mistake, repair. One evening, as swallows wrote their liquid lines over the green, there came a brief rap at the door. The postmistress's boy stood with a thin package and a note in a hand Miss Marple now recognized. "Dear Miss Marple," it read, "you will think me foolish to return a brooch meant for me, but this one is different. It belonged to her. I cannot keep it in a place where it will only speak to me. I send it to you because you will know when to give it new voice. When I am ready, I will come to Mary Mead and stand in the church not as a secret but as my mother's daughter. Until then, I remain gratefully. L. M. C." The parcel contained not the lily brooch that she would keep, Miss Marple understood, as identity, but a simple oval locket with a spray of dried lily of the valley inside and a miniature of the colonel not included. The choice told Miss Marple everything necessary about what Lydia intended to remember and what she intended to forget. She smiled, closed the locket in her palm, and later took it to the vicar, asking him to place it in the church's small glass case beside the embroidered kneelers and the tin soldiers from the village men's. Memorial unlabeled, undescribed. Just another quiet relic among the village's many. And so the matter settled itself, not with a clang but with the soft click of a drawer closing well. Willow House would belong to someone else before summer. Lionel Pierce would stand where men stand when they have mistaken want for worth. Lydia would be, in time, a face seen in Mary Mead without flinching. Miss Marple's life resumed its ordinary genius. Tea, knitting, kindness, an eye like a needle. She did not think of herself as having solved anything grand. She had merely, as always, attended to the small. On the Sunday after Ascension, the church bell was new polished and bright in its voice. Miss Marple, hat at a just-so angle, took her pew and folded her gloved hands. When the hymn rose, she sang in a clear, thin thread, and her eyes, for a moment, rested on the glass case near the vestry where the little oval locket lay. She was not thinking of crimes then. She was thinking of mercies that arrive late but in time to matter. Outside, after the service, the village breathed its long, contented breath. The children were loosed to the green. The vicar shook hands. Mrs. Hartnell declared that the strawberries would be early this year, and Mrs. Larkin contradicted her with authority. Miss Marple accepted a nosegay from a child and walked home past the hedge where the first roses had begun to lift their faces. She paused to smell one, not a lily, never again a lily if she could help it, and then went on. Small and neat in her blue coat, into the house where the desk sat by the window and the past, at last, made room for the present.